to the north and west. Much of its countryside is mountainous. Its narrow Red Sea coastal plain, one of the hottest and driest places in Africa. This is Eritrea, Africa's youngest nation. To the outside world, Eritrea is synonymous with constant conflict. More devastatingly, a 30-year-old secessionist war against Ethiopia, and a more recent conflict in 1998 over this strip of the border, the Badmir Plains. An estimated 100,000 people were killed in that war. Its evidence still strewn across much of the country. In the 1950s, when Eritrea came under Ethiopian administration, it possessed a sophisticated urban and industrial infrastructure, much of which was destroyed by years of conflict. Eritrea came under Italian control in 1889 and was named Mare Eritreum, after the Roman name for the Red Sea. It was captured by the British in 1941 and later federated with Ethiopia 11 years later. In 1952, Eritrea revolted, resulting in a civil war that lasted 30 years.
We were determined to not be held hostage to this conflict. We said, let's not get trapped and be hostage to this conflict. Let's do our developmental work, infrastructure, agriculture, social services, and mobilize our population.
To date, the evidence of that catastrophic war remains, stark reminders of the cost of war. All across the country, remnants of war such as these still lie undisposed. Like these three tankers, named Jaguar, Commander and Tiger, they are mounted here as a reminder of the human sacrifices. In museums, the spoils of war still bear testimony. To Eritreans, the long war of independence is never far removed from the reality of everyday life, the ghosts of war not yet laid to rest.
Well, this section was a great thing to all Eritreans, you know, because it showed us the steadfastness, the creativity and the resilience of the Eritrean fighters for independence, you know.
Eritrea emerged from its long independence war only to plunge once again into military conflict, first with Yemen and then Ethiopia. And it is hostilities such as these that have left Eritrea deeply suspicious of the outside world, and Eritreans a deeply nationalistic lot. It is Independence Week and thousands of Eritreans have thronged the streets in days of celebration. The sense of pride around the independence anniversary is palpable. They are not in the best of books with all their neighbors, which prompts Eritreans to adopt an inward-looking national mentality, cherishing every moment of their 17-year independence and indeed everything Eritrean. Now, every journey in Eritrea starts and ends with a cappuccino and a cup of English tea. We've had ours and we're now ready to start our journey. We're just 5 kilometers outside Asmara, heading towards the Red Sea. We don't really know what to expect, but our guide tells us it's hundreds of kilometers through mountainous and hilly terrain such as this. Let's find out. We begin the 7,000-foot descent towards the Red Sea just minutes into our journey. Altitude 2,200 meters above sea level. The spectacular mountain views drop off as we head west. The sight of camels leaves one with no doubt of the topography ahead. In this country, though, camels hold a particularly special position. Locals will tell you that the camel was the only mode of transportation for the fighters during the war, soldiering on side by side in harsh terrain. Eritrea is a land of surprises. Barely 10 minutes into our journey, it begins to rain, hailstorms. We soldier on. The rain stops though as suddenly as it began. We drive on undaunted by the landscape, through sandstorms, across bridges, and all along the road shows no sign of wear and tear despite the harsh terrain. For most of its 17-year independence period, Eritrea has been embroiled in disputes with its neighbors, making her deeply suspicious of the outside world. This winding road, like all others across the country, has been built by Eritrean workmanship. It is seen as Eritrea's lifeline, linking the country to the outside world. It is late afternoon by the time we finally arrive at our destination, the Red Sea. Massawa Harbour is one of Eritrea's 2 ports and the country's most important war trophy. The loss of the port city left Ethiopia effectively landlocked. Today, however, all across the harbour city there are signs of aggressive rehabilitation. Like most Eritrean towns and cities, not much of the previous destruction remains visible. In the early independence days, Massawa stood as a symbol of political liberation. Today, it is once again proving a symbol of Eritrea's determination for economic liberation. Asmara sempre primavera, or in English, it's always spring in Asmara, is an Italian proverb common in Eritrea, almost a greeting here. And indeed, the freshness of spring is one of the first things that strikes you as you drive through this mountainous region. The terrain, tamed, the mountains, picturesque. And here atop the Eritrean highlands on the eastern edge of the escarpment lies Asmara, an Italian-built colonial city, years of conflict having left it relatively undamaged. This is the Eritrean capital, Asmara, a city with a history dating back to 1890, when the Italians consolidated their colonial might in the region. But despite a later colonization by Britain and Ethiopia, the Italian influence remains a defining factor, lending the city its endearing name, Little Roma. Although Asmara's history dates back some 700 years, it was the entry of its colonial masters Italy in 1885 that marked a turning point in the city's heritage. Walking through the Eritrean capital, one is struck by the unmistakable traces of its colonial heritage in its infrastructure, its architecture, culture, culinary traditions and language. The streets are elegantly lined with palms and a string of boutiques, coffee shops and restaurants reminiscent of southern Italy. The city, arguably one of the safest on the African continent. Unlike many of the other towns in Eritrea, Asmara did not suffer heavy damage during the war. In its 30 years of Ethiopian occupation, however, the city was neglected and left to deteriorate, but it still retains its essential beauty. Eritrea itself is a country rich with history, political and social heritage. Like this palace built in 1776 and said to have been inhabited by the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie during his reign from 1916 to 1974. In the 1950s, when Eritrea came under Ethiopian administration, it possessed a sophisticated urban and industrial infrastructure, much of which was destroyed by years of conflict. The base of that infrastructure is still evident, however, making Asmara one of the more culturally and socially sophisticated African capitals. Beatrice Marshall, KTN, Asmara, Eritrea.